I am Larry Sicular with the Listening Project, and I'm here today to interview Ted Russell, who is a lawyer and business executive in Los Angeles, who's worked at the corporate level for large companies for a number of decades and is now running his own firm. Ted, the reason for the Listening Project is simply to listen to what the people I'm interviewing have to say about what is going on in the world. You can define as you wish. So why don't you kick this off by telling me what you think we're going through during this period?
Hmm. Well, thank you, Larry. Maybe the first answer is what aren't we going through, right? We're going through a global pandemic. We've got social justice issues, which have existed for a long time, but are seemingly only getting worse. Um, I thought a lot since we first spoke about what's going on in the world and what are the problems that we face. And it was really difficult to come up with one problem that tied it together. And I think the best that I can do is to say that I think the fundamental problem that we have, other than obviously a giant health pandemic, but as a people, I think the biggest problem that we have is we are vilifying people who have different views um, from our own. And I think that once we head down that path, and it's not a new phenomenon, that's happened for a while, but it feels to me like that has become much worse. And I think that has a number of really negative impacts. And I think it's going to be really challenging to fix. Um, Obviously, people have had really strong disagreements over really important issues for a long time. Um, what role should the government play in taxing people or providing benefits? Um, how should we be spending money? Should we spend it on defense or education or healthcare? Should we get involved in foreign conflicts or not? All of those decisions are really important and they involve really important trade-offs, and people can disagree about them. But it feels like we've changed from having disagreements about those things to actually just vilifying the people who have different views. The viewpoints either are getting stronger or they're being made to appear stronger, to the point where in my conversations, I find often when I discuss these things with people, it seems that their entire identity is now surrounding these positions. And that's really difficult because once it becomes your identity, it's a part of your core and it's hard to change, right? Even if you get good information on the other side, you spent so much time digging in that it's very hard to dig out. And to me, one of the most interesting examples is what's going on with social justice and the police in our country. Um, I, my own personal view, which I'll convey here, is I think most police are hardworking people who put their lives in danger to provide for public safety. They do a really hard job, and I think for the most part they do a really good job. But we get our police from the human race, and those people are flawed, and so they bring all of the flaws of humanity with them. In the same way that you can have flawed lawyers or doctors or real estate executives or journalists, and so some percentage of them are going to engage in misconduct. So the truth of it is, I think, nuanced, and people don't really like nuance. They want to have a bumper sticker or they want to have a tagline, and they don't really have the patience to dig further than that. And what happens, I think, is that we all stop talking about kind of the middle 90% of what's going on with policing and community relations, and we all start focusing on the fringe 5%. So the fringe 5%, what do I mean by that? Well, if you have protesters who become violent and begin looting, and you show images of that 24/7, then you're going to create a viewpoint that represents 90% of the behavior. And if you show images of a police beating and you show that 24/7, now you're going to have a perception maybe that's more common than it is. I don't want to suggest that it doesn't happen, that it's not real, that it's not serious, that we don't need to address it. But it's very difficult to tell from media, this is my point, how prevalent these issues are. And of course, any amount of police beating is completely unacceptable. Any amount of lawlessness is unacceptable and needs to be addressed. but it's very difficult when it feels like everybody's focused on the most fringe examples. And so how do those two people have a conversation? Because the images that they're surrounded by are the most extreme.
The most fringe examples make the news.
Well, exactly. And, this gets into the role of the media, which is complicated. I come from a family of journalists, and so I want to be respectful of them. And in general, I'm a big First Amendment person, but, the fact that everybody has phones recording everything at all times is great in a way, because it shares information, it creates accountability, it provides evidence and proof of abuses. Those things are all very important. But I also think that when if you record anything that everybody does all the time, you're going to see them at not their best moments. And hopefully all of our lives are not defined by what we do and what are not our best moments. I don't want to minimize or trivialize any of this. Obviously, there needs to be accountability, and thank goodness we have recordings of those things. But I think it's a problem in that we are getting inundated with this imagery, and it's not used in the best way all the time, right? These images are weaponized. It's not just about informing people so they can make good policy choices. But when you share video content, say on social media, it's not just there to promote public concern and seeding energy to drive change. It's there because often the person has an agenda to try to drive some kind of an outcome, and the content is being used to serve that agenda. Some of those agendas are perfectly legitimate and appropriate, but the problem really comes down to we've lost all sense of proportionality, right? So if there are 100 minutes in a police officer's day, or 100 minutes, hopefully there aren't, we can do math better than that, but if there are 100 things that happen, we're only seeing things on the extreme, and it really informs our judgment and changes the way that we think about things. And as you said, sort of, if it bleeds, it leads. And I think that's because a lot of the great things about technology have created problems, right? The explosion of media channels make it so that people can watch much more content. They can watch the content in many more places. And because of that explosion of content, there's a lot of noise, and it's very hard to break through. So how do you break through that noise and get noticed and get retweeted and refollowed and build up your subscriber count? Well, you need to have something that's unique and something that's differentiated. And how do you do that? You use something that's extreme, right? And you have a particular perspective that's known, right? Whatever the brand is of your channel or your distribution platform, you have to keep feeding content that fits that so that you can find a lane and take that audience. And I think, as consumers, that's really problematic, because the technology that says, if you like product X, you'll like product Y. I think that's great when you're trying to buy a brand of, paper towel. I think that when you're talking about consuming information and facts, it's really dangerous to say, if you watch this video, then you'll like this video. And that's what happens is we just keep getting into more and more of an echo chamber, into a lane where we're not exposed to other viewpoints, we're not exposed to other content. And so it's only the loudest and sort of most partisan viewpoints that are being heard. And, it's obviously true that if you tell me what your primary source of news is, I can tell you probably what your perspective is. And probably that perspective has only hardened since you started using that news source. And then we sort of go one level beyond that, where we're not just getting an echo chamber, and we're not simply talking about the legitimate viewpoints of our group, but we're now delegitimizing other viewpoints. We're mocking and ridiculing and snarking at the other side. And by the way, I think this happens on both sides. And that creates a very strong kind of team mentality, I think, us versus them, my channel versus your channel. And you start mocking people, right? Can you believe the liberals are so stupid as to think this will work? And then can you believe that the conservatives are so ill-informed and uneducated that they would believe that thus and so is the case, when that's not the fact? And I just think that moving from having a viewpoint to now having it become part of your identity. And then that identity kind of turns into an affiliation with a group. It's almost a team mentality, and that it becomes us versus them. And, us or we or us are the good guys, and they and them are the outsiders who are either stupid or evil or ill-informed. And I just think if we look around the world, there are not a lot of great examples of how us them thinking has served the world. Um, and I think in the United States, it's particularly interesting because we're so given to competition. My team versus your team, my town, Boston versus New York. I'll wear I'll wear the jersey for my team. I'll yell the chants. But that then turns into chanting at games, turns into, fist fights at games, turns into people, dying at games. We've seen that. And I think that there are very few contexts where that us versus them thinking is productive, maybe in business context or in a sports context. But when it becomes rich versus poor and black versus white and cops versus citizens, I think that us them thinking creates a lot of problems.
Now, you've diagnosed the problem clearly. Did you think about also what you would propose to try to back off from it?
Yeah. I'm afraid I have very unsatisfactory answers here. It's still very much a work in progress. Even in my own thinking, I wake up on different days with different thoughts on this. So I don't have really a specific set of tools to fix it, because frankly, and sadly, I think we're only likely to see more of these kinds of problems. I think we're going to see more specialized media channels. We're going to see more extreme content, more social media that is creating echo chambers and sort of echoing the same kind of thinking, which is one of the reasons I love what you're doing here, because you are creating a platform specifically for people to offer different viewpoints and have civil discourse about it, and maybe hear the perspective of someone that influences your thinking, right? I won't name the politician, but I remember somebody getting challenged on changing their point of view, and the politician said something to the effect of, when I get new information, I reconsider my viewpoint. What do you do? And the implication is we should all be open to new information, and we should all be open to reconsidering our viewpoints. If you're not opening to reconsidering your viewpoints, even if you get different information, now you're just a zealot, right? And then you're no longer in discourse, you're in advocacy. And I think that becomes part of the problem. So one of the solutions, I think, is to try to decouple people and their identities from the positions they take. And I'm stealing that concept from an old negotiation book called Getting to Yes, which is written by Roger Fisher and William Ury. They're Stanford professors, I believe.
I've heard of that book.
Yeah, well, it's pretty much the go-to book on negotiation. I've been teaching negotiation for 15 years at USC, UCLA, and Pepperdine. I actually haven't used that particular book, but it's obviously the baseline for so much of what we do. And it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. But they talk about trying to separate the people from their positions, because once you associate the person with the position, it creates a cycle or spiral that's not productive. And look, this is not to say that there are not real points of division, right? You can have a very spirited debate about that you might say is between rich and poor, right? How much of the wealth generated by a rich person is even generated by the rich person, as opposed to the system that we all support, and how much should they keep versus how much should they support others, and how do you calculate that? So that's a legitimate point of difference. But I don't think that it's helpful when somebody says, I think there should be more sharing, to say you're a Marxist, and that has never worked, or to say some view of the opposite, right? I just don't think that attaching people to the positions is helpful. And I also think that it has to do with how we discuss these issues. In general, I'm maybe a little old-fashioned. I am a fan of civil discourse. I do believe that people can talk rationally, and that they can hear each other if they put effort into it, and that they can think and listen and change their viewpoints. I know that there is a point of view that really serves the status quo, and it serves the people who have power now, and that you need to have more sort of radical activism to shake up the status quo, and that merely sitting down to have a civil dialogue with people who are so fundamentally opposed to you is serving the system. It's becoming part of the problem, and that, these are the tear it all down people. And perhaps there are aspects of our life and our civil life together where they need to be shaken up more. But I just do not believe that there isn't a role, or say it differently, I believe there is a role, an important role for civil dialogue and discourse. But I just, in general, my viewpoint is, no one in the history of man has ever been insulted into agreement. So vilifying and insulting people in order to try to change their point of view is completely counterproductive. I think they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to be educated, and it's probably only going to deepen their points of view. So I think that's the biggest first point, is you have to separate people from the positions and give one another a chance to listen and potentially learn.
I have a few questions. Since people often craft their identity around their positions, if you separate them from their positions, they may feel a loss of identity. They might not know who they are without holding on to their positions. How would you advise restructuring their self-perception so that they're holding on to something more, I would say, fundamental than their current positions?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. What is it that's more fundamental, right? What happens is that there are two things going on, right? You have, and this is a negotiation concept again, you have underlying interests that you're trying to serve, and then you have positions that you take to try to serve those interests. Mm-hmm. And the metaphor or the visual that we often use is an iceberg, right? The part that's sticking out over the water that you can see is called the position. That's what they're telling you their position is. The part that's under the water that you can't see immediately is called their underlying interest. And the purpose, one purpose of negotiation, is to hear the position, but then to ask questions about where the position comes from, so you can understand the underlying interest that they're trying to accomplish, and then see if you can come up with an alternative position that will satisfy that underlying interest, assuming that it's a legitimate underlying interest.
Okay, so now I'd like to apply all of what you've said, including this last tool, which I think was really good, the way you described it, to a couple of the things you've mentioned. One is, how might this be applied to the problem of police reform, this approach? And two is, how might this be applied to the problem of the pandemic and social distancing versus the economy?
So you picked the two easiest ones, right? Okay.
And the two current ones.
They're relevant. Well, look, I think let's take the police example, right? So the positions that you see people taking, right? The police are bad people doing bad things who are victimizing the people they're supposed to protect. So that's one position. Mm-hmm. The other one is, I can't believe that my dad, my husband, my wife gets up every day, puts on a uniform, and puts their life in danger to go try to protect people who are walking up to them in police cars and shooting them in the head for no reason, right? So that's the iceberg. So now that's the top of it that we can see. Let's go to the underlying interest. So what is it that we can all agree on? Let's start with core principles. There should be a degree of freedom. There should be a degree of privacy. We can talk about how to measure these things and how much. We would like for people to feel fundamentally safe. We would like for people to have that, and maybe I'm doing it backwards. People should feel fundamentally safe so that they can go be free to pursue, the lawful, legitimate, fair ends that they want to pursue. And the police are charged with providing that core level of safety. And when the police go too far and they go from providing safety to actually being unfair and coming down too hard on a group of people, it actually imposes on their freedom, right? So it actually undermines a core value. Because if you apply it to the police, everyone's going to value living in a society that's fundamentally safe. The question is, how do you go about doing that, right? One group would say, well, if I just arm the police much more heavily, more guns equals more safety, right? Another group would say, no, more guns, more death, more harm. Let's use those same funds to fund mental health personnel as a more effective way of intervening in conflicts so that they can potentially not escalate. So both groups are trying to serve the goal of safety. That's the core value, but they're different ways of I guess my overall point is if you dig deep enough, if you go below the tip of the iceberg, you can usually find some kind of a core shared value. And so I'm going to fight your hypothetical a little bit. When you say, what do you do to people when you take their identity away? What I would say is to reframe it. Their identity should be framed around the interest, the core value. And we are allowing the identity to be framed around the position or the manifestation or the expression of that interest. And that's where I think media and all of the rest becomes a problem. Your other question was about the pandemic, but I'm going to need you to repeat it because I'm not sure how we do this. I mean, I guess it's about social distancing and relative degrees of freedom. And
yes, exactly. So we have a huge split in this country, which has become political around the wearing of masks, the using of shutdowns, the ability to go to work, and the freedom to worship or assemble. So and the conversations are not nuanced, as you have said. They tend to be very absolute. But why don't you apply the same tool you applied to the police analysis to this one and let's see where it goes.
Life is easy when you have two core values and they both point to the same solution, right? In healthy times, safety and freedom are generally aligned. So now we have two core values that we really care about, and now they're potentially in conflict because if you have unlimited health and safety, you might have zero freedom. Right. And if you have unlimited freedom, you might compromise health. So the question is, it's like a deck of cards. Where do you put the card in the deck? I'm not sure that it's quite as zero sum as that 1 degree of freedom is one less degree of safety. And obviously, again, my negotiation background is coming out here, but you're looking for win-win outcomes. You're looking for ways to increase safety without compromising freedom or to increase freedom without compromising safety. And at some point, the rubber hits the road and you're going to have to make difficult choices and trade-offs. I think that this really cuts to the core question of duties to, or sort of individual rights versus community rights and community interests, right? If we are focused solely on community interests, then we would be willing to make choices to limit individual freedom to serve the community interests. And if we are focused solely on individual freedoms, then we would allow people to do whatever they want. And I guess what I would say to that is, I think that the mask wearing is a really good example of how politicized something that relatively simple can become. People lose sight of the fact that we make choices all the time to limit individual freedom in the name of serving community interests, right? Why is it that you need to drive on the right side of the road? If you're completely free, you drive wherever you want. Well, because there's a countervailing societal interest. So I think it's interesting that we're getting so caught up in the idea that there shouldn't be any limitations of individual freedom. I don't understand the protesters who are proudly congregating without masks as a way of showing their freedom, right? I think that the core value there is, they're America first. They want to support the country. In order to support the country, people have got to be healthy. They have to, we have to have people not dying. We have to have people who can work. We have to have people who can earn a living and go take care of their mental health and exercise and do all sorts of things. So to me, I would say the person who's congregating with, hundreds of their friends holding the American flag, I would question whether they're actually serving their own stated interest. They're probably doing lots of things where they have blindly accepted a limitation on their freedom in the name of serving, the society that they don't think about. But this is something new, and so it's a rallying point, and it's become politicized. My own point of view on masks is, I don't understand why we can't go with science. And it's not that science is completely pure and that science doesn't evolve and that there aren't scientists with different points of view, but the scientists seem to be saying that masks are really helpful in limiting the transmission. I read something the other day that says if you think a mask is uncomfortable, try a ventilator. Um, Now, on the other hand, I think that this pandemic is affecting people very differently. And again, there's not a lot of nuance. Um, it's very difficult with 332 million people in the country to give very nuanced, different solutions for everyone because this is such a new experience. People will not accept it. So you end up having to have kind of a blunt instrument of shutdowns and so forth. And then there are legitimate questions that get asked. You know, if children are less likely to be harmed by this, then why aren't we keeping our schools open and having in-person learning? Um, there are deep long-term impacts from having people fall behind, and it's disproportionately on disadvantaged groups during this time. What about mental health? What about social skills and all of these things? Aren't we doing a real disservice to those people? So it seems to me that we can agree on fundamental core principles, but then ultimately we need to make trade-offs.
Is there something you'd like to say to conclude regarding what you said?
Um, I think I've said it. I guess my wrap up would be, you know, try. I think all of us need to try to really hear and listen to other people. And we may not like the way they're saying it, that we may not like the group they're associated with, but I would urge us all to think of it. It's like panning for gold. You know, you put all of the sand in there and then you shake it, you shake it, you shake it, and a lot of it falls out, but maybe there's a nugget in there somewhere. So maybe as you're listening to someone who has a radically different point of view from you, see if there isn't some nugget in there that would be worth considering, and see if there's not a way of maybe even repackaging their point and maybe making their point in a more compelling way that resonates with you more deeply. And I think we need to keep in mind that for the most part, I think that good people can have very fundamentally different views. And I think that the more we can get away from attacking people and vilifying them and identifying them with a position, and the more we can hear them as individuals who have a bunch of different inputs that are different from the inputs that we've had in our life experiences, news sources, friends, things they've overheard, books they've read, and try to learn and understand, I think we'll be a little bit better down the path.